Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. And I'm going to dive in without further ado, introduce my panelists who are here, and give you a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about. Traditionally, biographies tend to trace a life in linear chronological form. They go from youth to maturity to senescence and death. And there's also often a kind of omniscient, critical, or narrative distance. The narrator knows what cards are in the deck that he or she has, and then he or she deals them out in order. But the writers here have dared to approach life writing in a very different way. They've created polyphonic, kaleidoscopic narratives. They just blow the roof off of biography in a way. And these people are Craig Brown, who is author of 2 such biographies. I'm going to give you the American titles so that you can find them. I think the English titles are actually better, but I won't tell them. 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret and 150 Glimpses of the Beatles. Gillian Gill, who is author of Virginia Woolf and the Women Who Shaped Her World. And Ash Carter and Sam Cashman. Alas, Sam Cashman is probably not going to be able to join us because his internet connection is not working, who have given us Life Isn't Everything, Mike Nichols, as remembered by 150 of his closest friends. And I want to ask each of you, could you start by telling us what made you decide to tell your subject's story in the way that you chose? Craig, you have written 2 books this way, each of them about very, very different people, actually about one person and 4 people. But what was it about Princess Margaret that inspired you to write that book in the way that you did, as a kind of mosaic, and then to use something of the same method with the Fab Four? Can you tell us?
Yes. Well, actually, I did a book before Princess Margaret, which in America was called Hello, Goodbye, Hello, which was a daisy chain of 101 meetings. So, for instance, you have Kipling met Mark Twain met Mark Twain met Helen Keller, Helen Keller met Martha Graham met Madonna met Michael Jackson met Nancy Reagan, and it goes on, and then there's a circle completed, and each of those meetings I wrote in exactly 1,001 words. And so I've always liked this idea of having a pattern to it, because the drab pattern to the conventional biography is simply sort of cradle to grave. It's barely a pattern at all. It's just a kind of chronological trawl. But so I like a bit of sort of symmetry and that sort of thing. And so having had 101 different people meeting each other, I then, with Princess Margaret, I thought, well, it'd be interesting having 101 people, all of whom met the same person, and different accounts of the meeting. Now, so I got that signed up by a publisher, but then what I hadn't bargained for was that Princess Margaret's meetings with people were almost exactly the same. They followed the same routine of it tended to be her getting drunker and oddly more formal and more haughty the drunker she got. So she'd start. Anyway, I realized you couldn't just retell the same story 101 times. Different characters.
Oh, God, you're making me laugh.
So I devised a different way of doing of Princess Margaret, which was, in America, it was called 99 Glimpses. And it was just different, seeing her from different angles. In some ways, no matter how random the angle. I mean, one of them was simply a dream I had while writing the book about Princess Margaret, and there were or other alternatives like it's a fact that Pablo Picasso had strong sexual attraction towards Princess Margaret, without Princess Margaret knowing this, of course, because they never met. But I take this, and he even devised a wedding ceremony and things like that. But I take it one further, and so I have a parallel life where they meet, and so where they marry, and there is an actual royal wedding, and I work out how the marriage would have gone. Anyway, so it was just a way of doing whatever I wanted in a book, but giving it a kind of pattern. Now with the Beatles, they were different from Princess Margaret. Obviously, they sort of shared the same kind of celebrity life in Britain. The big difference between Margaret and the Beatles was that Margaret was essentially quite a dull character, and with very little progress in her life. She didn't even move house or anything. I mean, she married and got divorced. That was almost the extent of her activity. Whereas the Beatles are obviously, from the word go, they're interesting. There are 4 of them, so they're 4 times as interesting as an individual. And they had this great kind of myth about them, of a kind of rags to riches, and these 4 completely obscure working class Liverpool lads are suddenly becoming the most famous 4 people in the world. And so that has its own storyline. Now, there had been 1,000 books, 1,000 or so books written about them before. So obviously there's no point doing another along the normal biographical lines, which really left me, so I treated all the other books as my research assistants, and I just felt I could do whatever I wanted. So I have, for instance, my father once encountered John Lennon and Yoko Ono in a hotel doorway. So I have a chapter on that. I mean, even though this was completely immaterial in a way to the Beatles' lives, totally immaterial to their lives. Or I wanted to tackle Brian Epstein, who's a fascinating figure. And I did his life in reverse. So starting with his funeral and then ending the book on the moment that he goes down the 17 stairs of the Cavern Club in Liverpool and sees the Beatles for the first time. So I could, within each chapter, I could play with narrative, and as well as having the straight story. Or there's another chapter I do where I compare all the different accounts of, in 1963, John Lennon got into a fight with a Liverpudlian disc jockey called Bob Willer, and there are all the different accounts in the various biographies and autobiographies, and a lot of them eyewitness, but they were all completely different. And so it was just an exercise in showing how the biographer's job is in some way a bogus job, because you can never work out what happened, even with very recent history. And all these people were, as far as you could tell, giving honest accounts. I mean, some weren't. Some biographers who hated John Lennon were giving a sort of biased account. And then once I wrote all these chapters, I then pieced them together like a kind of mosaic or a jigsaw. And I hope that gave it some kind of shape. So I hope that's about the right length of an answer.
It is, it's perfect, and reminded me of many things that I want to talk about later. So we will go on from there. Gillian, you took on somebody who was as iconic as the Beatles, Virginia Woolf. Somebody who's been written about and written about and written about by critics and by literary historians. And you found a completely different way of presenting her. You kind of refracted her story through all of these women who were in her family or who were her friends. How did you come to decide to do that?
I didn't start out as a biographer, and I haven't really ended up that way. So in a sense, this is just a continuation of what I started with my Agatha Christie book, which was my first book. What I like to do is, because I'm trained as a literary critic, I'm a failed academic. I like to write essays, and I like to write essays particularly about published texts, not real people, published texts. That sounds so boring. And when I tried to write a book about using Agatha Christie and doing critical essays on her, my editor said in the very last minute, Gillian, you have to make this into a biography. And I said, really, that's tough because Agatha Christie's papers are famously all locked up and no one gets to see them. And anyway, I wouldn't be able to go. And how do I do this? So I did sort of that. And then I got sort of trapped in the biographical machine for a while. And then when I came up and wanted to do something that would be really fun for me, that was my Colette book, which I couldn't even get published, damn it. So there I tried to do what I called a biographical novel, which was taking a piece of Colette's life that was singularly ill documented. So I move out of the documents, which is where biography, sort of traditional biography, lies, and I move it into fiction. I make up all the scenes about her life that nobody knows about and that are vaguely referred to. And notably in that book, I look very seriously into her relationship with the trans aristocrat, the Marquise de Belleboeuf, Missy. So I dived into that. It was a total disaster. And so when I come out of that disaster, I move towards something kind of iconic that I might actually find a publisher for. And I came up with Virginia Woolf, who had been an enormous influence on my life. And this is where I would like to introduce this whole thing about biography as autobiography. That's to say, when we write about, this can't be true, of course, with Craig and Princess Margaret, who is a loathsome person. And I know Craig is a lovely person. So why exactly he did that book isn't entirely clear to me, except that he got it published and it sold 1 million copies because Princess Margaret is incredibly famous. So with Virginia Woolf, what do? She's had 2 fabulous British biographies. I mean, Britain is the home of great biography. So many of the greatest biographies in the world have been written by British authors. So I'm treading on sacred ground. You know, there's a big trespasser's will up on the whole subject. So what I try to do is to interweave my particular interest in this late stage in my life, which are basically familial. It's basically about relationships, and try and dive into relationships within Virginia Woolf's life, some of them with people she never knew, like her great-great-great-grandmother, who one discovers had Bengali blood, was a woman of color, which was to me tremendously interesting. And then her adoptive aunt, her mother, her sisters, particularly the 2 sisters who almost get no print in the biographies because they seem to have so little influence on her. And yet I know from my own life that when sisters who fail or go mad or have in fact an enormous effect upon you, it's just that you don't write about them. So I dive in as far as I can. And finally, I come up with her relationship with her famous sister. And that's where I had a horrible time because I didn't want to do it at all. And my editor said to me, Gillian, you cannot leave out the sister-sister. And since sister-sister relationships are, again, of enormous interest to me, I dived into it. And I think in the end, the book had a biographical shape because what that does, in my view, is to give a narrative arc to a book. But one tries not to end up with the death, because that really is a magnificent downer, right? So you try and manipulate the pieces so that you don't, in the case of Woolf, stress her as a victim. To me, this was incredibly important. Yes, she committed suicide, but she had fought valiantly since the age of 13 to stay alive and working. That was the story I wanted to tell. So I didn't want to end up with her walking into the river with a stone in her pocket. I wanted to end with her, in a sense, alive and speaking to us today.
That's terrific. Thank you. So Ash, speaking for yourself and for Sam, when you started writing Life Isn't Everything, Mike Nichols, unlike Virginia Woolf, was not virgin territory. I mean, he was virgin territory. He had not been written about at all, except maybe critically. Certainly nobody had ever written a soup to nuts biography of him. And, you know, you might have thought, oh, why don't I do that? But you didn't. You wrote instead a fugue for 150 different voices here. What made you decide to do that? What about his life said, no, don't do the narrative thing, do this?
Well, so Sam and I, we had bonded previously about our shared love of Mike Nichols. We each have our own sort of slim link to him. I worked as a PA on Charlie Wilson's War, Mike's last movie. Sam wrote a few articles about him with it, you know, where he interviewed him, and I wrote a spec script that never got made. But so basically, after Mike died, Sam approached me and said, let's just kind of interview some of his friends and do a kind of oral reminiscence as a magazine article. And so that's really how it started. And we just kind of made a list of like 40 people and interviewed them, and we kind of, you know, wove them together. Then in between that and when we sold our own book, we did, you know, Mark Harris did get a book deal for his traditional biography. So that is one reason why we didn't go down that road ourselves. But the other is just that we already had, we had already, you know, had what was published plus a lot of other stuff that didn't make its way into the article. And we just knew that even in, I mean, that was an 11,000 word article, there was still so much on the table. And I think that he does lend himself very well to this kind of format. I mean, an oral biography is never going to be the last word on a subject. So we, you know, all the great oral biographies that have already been written, I mean, maybe I guess with the possible exception of Edie, but you know, there's a great one of Truman Capote, but there's also a great biography, etc. So we had no expectation this was going to be the last word, but he is a good subject for oral biography because, first of all, you need people. So they need to have a lot of friends, a lot of people that they work with, etc. And it helps if they're articulate, and it helps even more if they're famous. So in terms of getting the book published. So he had all those things going for him. He was, you know, a tremendously social person. If you're writing about an artist, it helps a lot if they work in a collaborative medium like film or theater or improv comedy, as Mike did, you know, as opposed to say doing an oral biography of a writer sitting at their, you know, typewriter, or a painter, or, you know, something like that. And there's something a little bit unknowable about him. So even though he had all these, everybody sort of thought of him as a best friend, which is what we sort of, you know, nodded to in the title, but nobody really knew the full man. So we felt like there's going to be, we hoped that some kind of gestalt would emerge from all these little fragments. And there, I mean, so traditional biography is no question, it's a heavier lift for the writer, but it's also a heavier lift for the reader. So we felt freer to, leave things out and sort of give the book a little bit more of a limited focus on just his sort of inner life and his career and his friendships, essentially. And even in the work, we felt like we could kind of pick and choose what we were going to focus on, because unlike, say, like Robert Altman, who's the subject of another oral biography that's structured where each chapter is one of his movies, you know, the nature of Mike Nichols' career and the enthusiasm that people have for him is different, where, you know, Altman's failures were noble failures and Mike Nichols' failures were not really. They were, that's part of the pathos of the book, is that, you know, he was really at his best when he was doing things for the right reasons, and at his worst when he was doing things for the wrong reasons. And so, we felt as long as we kind of covered that theme and showed one or two or three failures, that was kind of enough. We don't need to, spend too much time on that kind of stuff. So, I mean, those were all the pluses. Now, I mean, there were some difficulties with the format, because when you're doing an oral biography, you're limited to the living. And Mike, lived pretty long. He died, at 85 or 80 or something. I can't remember, but he outlived a lot of contemporaries already, and a lot of the people who he worked with and knew early in his life were getting up there. So that was a bit of a challenge, and some people surprised us by dying young before we got to them. Luckily, there were a few people who did, even though this was the first book about him. John Lahr had profiled him extensively in the New Yorker. Julian Schlossberg had done 2 American Masters documentaries about him. And there were 2 books about the Compass Theater. And so all those people very nicely let us quote from the interviews they had done, because that really helped us a lot. There would have been some very glaring gaps otherwise. So I mean, I think that it's a, again, it's not the last word, but I think it's a way of structuring a book that I've really enjoyed in the past with certain other books, because it's less, I mean, it's edited obviously, but it's less mediated. It's not as digested. There's less of that omniscience that you're talking about. There's less kind of both authorial judgment, but also sometimes, a biographer feels the need to kind of be an apologist for bad behavior for their subjects. And we don't, we actually went even a little bit further than some oral biographies we admired we don't have any interstitials. We don't have anything except for just the, direct edited interviews that we have. And so that's really, there are, the book, we hope, does have some shape, and there are some kind of unexpected resonances, but
We'll get to that.
yeah, well, I mean, John Simon, who reviewed our book, actually had a very, I never quite, because when certain subjects we had approached weren't familiar with the oral biography format, and I, explained it in a somewhat cliched way as like a mosaic. But he pointed out in his review that an oral biography is not like a mosaic, because when you're doing a mosaic, you have to plan it out from before you start. You know what the final image is going to look like, and when you're doing an oral biography, you don't. And he's right. And there were a lot of surprises along the way, and we really kind of let what we got just shape itself, kind of.
Well, actually, as you've stumbled right into a question I was going to ask, and I was going to ask you later, but I'll ask you right now because you brought it up. So, you're working with a lot of interviews. You've got a kind of a grab bag thing going on here. You don't know what you're going to get necessarily. It's kind of like writing a documentary screenplay, and you just have a whole lot of interviews. You don't know quite how you're going to shape them. So how did you build narrative tension with this kind of voice collage? How do you choose which testimony to put where? Because I was very struck by how you managed to do that, and I just wanted to hear from you what your method had been.
I guess there are a few. So I mean, we had a sense just from the prior interviews we had done, and just some familiarity with his life and career before, with what had already been done, of what the sort of general arc was of his life. And we knew that there were certain works that are just going to get their own chapter, from the Compass Theater to Nichols and May to Graduate, Virginia Woolf, and later on Angels in America. But for example, we did not, I was not originally, Sam and I were not planning on focusing a lot of attention on The Designated Mourner, which Mike did not direct, but he acted in, the Wallace Shawn play directed by David Hare. But in the course of our interviews, we just found that it was it gave you such an unexpected and interesting glimpse of him, because he's kind of not in the director's chair. He's and he's not also not. It's not a comedy. What was he going to be like to be? How kind of cooperative would he be, et cetera. And just, it's a very kind of avant-garde play. So something like that, for example, was not part of the plan. And we were so surprised by how, I mean, it helps that when you're talking to, Wallace Shawn and David Hare, that that these are two very insightful, articulate people. And so that was a big reason why it's one of the shorter chapters, but nonetheless, we were surprised by something like that. But, besides that, you kind of, some people are just good talkers and some people are not. And so, that certain things are just kind of obvious. Like Dustin Hoffman, for example, is just an unbelievable storyteller. And so we really just kind of let him go on for probably more than any other single person in the book. And it helps that he was, a very important person in a key moment in his career, and somebody on whom Mike Nichols had a transformative effect, even though they had a bit of a difficult relationship. But and then, by talking to people over time, you start to figure out what some of the less obvious themes are going to be. And once you've got, once we had a kind of a 1.5 foot high or 2 foot high stack of transcripts, you just kind of, when we did the article, we literally cut the things up with scissors and kind of pasted them onto a legal pad. This was a little bit unmanageable in book form, but, I just kind of figured out what we thought was interesting, put it in different buckets of different projects or different themes. And then, there is a kind of like a, I don't know, so you just want to figure out how you want each quote to just kind of lead to the next one. And of course, these people are not talking in the room, but you want it to seem like that a little bit. And so we worked hard to achieve that. And another thing is that the texture of people's speech is an important part of a book like this, but, people don't always talk in a way that's ready for publication, in the sense that they're and indeed, if somebody was to put what I'm saying right now on paper, it would probably seem totally incoherent. So
do you save them from themselves?
You have to be a little bit creative in terms of how you are going to edit somebody's speech, trim it down, or reorder it a little bit, but while preserving their particular cadences. And, I'm happy, at least I was happy that certain people told me afterwards that they felt like they sounded like themselves, because we did have to do a certain amount of that in the process. But I hope that answers your question.
I am going to just interrupt myself and all of us here and say, if people want to start putting questions in chat, they can do it at any time. And when we get to them at the end, we at least we'll have them built up. So feel free, all of you, if you have questions as you're going along, just put them in the chat, typed to everyone, and we'll see them. Okay, going on. Craig, let's talk about your shaping mechanisms here. Each of your Glimpses books has a kind of different rhythm and arc. Each of them is somewhat chronological, and each of them has a very resonant shape. The Margaret book begins with this kind of quick, like a little play within the play, like the play within the play in Hamlet, with all of the little news bulletins about her life that really tells us what the shape of it is going to be. The Beatles book, by contrast, begins with that story about Brian Epstein coming to the club in Liverpool, which will then repeat itself as if it were a reprise of a song at the very end of the book. And it's just unbearably poignant when it does, at least it was to me. How soon did you know that you were going to give those books the shapes that they acquired?
With the Brian Epstein thing, that was quite late on in the book. I was more and more intrigued by Brian Epstein. I was thinking, well, how do I cover him? Does he have his own chapter? And then I thought, well, if you do, the whole last chapter is his life in reverse. So it starts with his funeral and ends up with him meeting the Beatles for the first time. And I think in a way that had a kind of, it wasn't just being, trying to be clever. I hoped it had some kind of emotional resonance, because when he meets the Beatles for the first time, that's the beginning of the Beatles' lives as Beatles. I think if he hadn't met them, you could easily argue that they would never have become the successes they did become. And so it's the beginning of their kind of liberation and freedom, but it's also the beginning of Brian Epstein's death, in a way, that he was the one. Always when I was 10 when the Beatles were at their peak of their fame, and I always saw Brian Epstein as the sort of dull grown up, because he always looked smart, had short hair and everything like that. But in fact, first, he wasn't much older than them, but also he was far more addicted to drugs, far more unsure of himself. And if he hadn't met the Beatles, then he would probably have gone on kind of managing his family record business and would have come to terms with life in some way. So what was their great salvation was his doom. And so that was why I did the chapter like that. With the Princess Margaret book, in a funny way, because her life was much more static, I was able to be much more experimental in the telling of it. And also, there wasn't that much information about her. I mean, there was a certain amount of information about her, but I almost put everything that I came across of interest, I bunged it in somewhere. Whereas with the Beatles, you could really pick a single day in the life of the Beatles and turn it into a book. Because first, their lives were very active, their characters were all different. They had this extraordinary gallery of people around them, from Maharishi or the sort of hangers-on, Magic Alex. So I have a long chapter about someone who was a Beatle for 10 years. Ringo became ill, had to go to hospital. They were going on tour of Australia the next day, and to create a new Beatle to replace Ringo. And what became of that man? He was called Jimmy Nicol, and actually it kind of ruined his life, having had the adulation of the world for 10 days and then being chucked out. And so with the Beatles, I had to do it in some ways more formally, in that there is the arc of them coming from nowhere and then becoming super famous and figures of sort of worldwide significance, really, even politically, like with changing the Soviet Union to some extent. And so I had to keep to a chronology in a way that I didn't with Princess Margaret. So in some ways, you could say that I had more fun with Princess Margaret, even though, or perhaps because I was more bored by her, it just prompted me to kind of think, how can I make this interesting? How can I have fun with this? Whereas the Beatles provide their own fun. And so all you have to do is provide the echo of that fun and excitement in the book.
Brilliant. Gillian, you had a number of strands that you were weaving together here. There's the story of Woolf's Anglo-Indian French ancestors and the high Bohemian paddle ancestors, the Thackeray's, the Bloomsburys. So how did you decide which story to tell first, which story to tell last, which to tell second, where to place the story that I found just unbearably poignant about Laura Stephen? That story was just heartbreaking. Where to put the whole question of her relationship with Vanessa. How did you decide what to put where and when?
Well, this is where the biography thing helps me, because I do follow the arc of the life. And that pins me down. And then I proceed chronologically when I do my research. And so I write up as I go along.
Yeah.
I mean, I rewrite and I rework and, do all kinds of editing and rethinking. But at the beginning, I don't know where I'll end. I think this is where I'm differing from my fellow panelists. I really don't know what I'm going to come up with. And in fact, I did not know until I wrote my last pages. I had no idea that a dominant interest in my life is the whole issue of child abuse. And that this would, having gone through Virginia Woolf's life, as it were, read in not just extensively, I mean, she is so extensive. I mean, I cannot claim to have read everything that woman wrote, but just as Craig said that you could write a whole novel about one day in the Beatles' life, I could take one page of Virginia Woolf and write a huge essay. I mean, she is so alive on the page and so vivid. And so there is so much of that. You can't deal with it all. And so just by working through, it was suddenly came to me that I could weave this whole question of how her madness related to the treatment she received at the hands of her half-brothers, how that affected her, not as a victim. Again, I really wanted to say this, that she, unlike her three sisters actually, but particularly her sisters, Laura, who was confined to an institution at the age of 20 and never, ever escaped it, and then her sister, Stella, who died at the age of, I think, 29. And then her sister, Vanessa Bell, who has been seen as an apostle of sexual liberation, and I don't think was at all when you look at her life. So I look at the lives and see how those three women dealt with this atmosphere of sexual weirdness to the point of perversion. That was a common structure in Victoria households. When I see Virginia, by her art, because she used writing as therapy, as her grounding in reality, as a way of warding off the forces of let's call it madness. Okay, she had an extremely severe mood disorder. So she uses writing to shape and understand and grapple with and introduce into her fiction and introduce into her writings themes of what happens to children when they're small and how that can affect the whole course of their life. And as we've seen in the 21st century, that theme has become incredibly dominant. And I didn't get it at the beginning. I only got it by working through and coming out with that. And that's why it ends as, this is a woman who never had any children, who wanted to have children, who could, because she had this hyper thin skin, feel what it was like for children to be in an oppressive situation. Thanks to all that, she was able to voice at a very early stage currents that have become important to us in the 21st century in the United States, and that I didn't think had been brought out, and which, as I say, had only come to me by doing this slog through her work. And I came out feeling about her as a victor, not a victim.
Gillian, I'm going to just take you a little further along here and ask you, because you are sometimes telling the same story from multiple points of view, there are some incidents that get repeated occasionally during the book. I mean, inevitably, the death of Toby Stephen, for instance. Did you find the repetition of these things a challenge to deal with, or did you think as you were going along, oh, now I get a chance to present this from this other point of view, from so-and-so's perspective or that perspective? Did you see this as a challenge or an opportunity, I guess I would say?
I think it's a challenge. I really do. And I worked, I mean, that whole incident of the formation of the Bloomsbury Group happened because of Toby Stevens' death. And so how do you deal with that? Now, on the one hand, I didn't want to deal with the Bloomsbury Group. I mean, this sounds extremely odd to start off, but I really actually didn't, because notably, most of the people that I know in England said, you know, Great Britain is totally sick of the Bloomsbury Group. We don't want to hear another word about it. Everything has been said that can be said. And I think, really? Well, I think I have some things to say about it, but none of it will go down very well. So I had trouble placing that. I absolutely did. And I'm not sure I got it right, incidentally. I mean, I have a feeling that there's this moment in my book when it falls apart, and that's in the Thackeray section, when I really do feel, and I actually put this in, you know, my readers are thinking, why the hell are we going into Thackeray? Whoever reads Thackeray? I mean, nobody knows anything about Thackeray. Why aren't we talking about Virginia Woolf and Jane Austen or whoever, right? But, you know, to me, the Thackeray thing was the key to the whole equation. Because, I mean, one of the things that I'm interested, I said I was interested in family, in intimate relations, mother-daughter, 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 granddaughter, with a sort of, which I've never actually managed to get into, but how a famous person in the middle between a not famous mother and a not famous daughter, how that all works out. I'm very fascinated by that, the relationship between sisters. The other thing is, since I, you know, did not come out of money, I'm always really interested in how people get it and how they use it. And above all, how women get it. Because, you know, traditionally, property has been passed from male to male. So I'm interested, you know, I suddenly think, whoa, you know, why did, you know, Virginia Woolf have this lovely home in Cornwall? I mean, summer home. Why was she able to live? Why were her brothers being able to be sent to public school? This all came out of the Thackeray money. And so I have to try and find a way of getting into the Thackeray money. And that's how I come up with the fact that they were able to go on the sisters, Vanessa and Virginia, and their brother Toby and their brother Adrian were able to go on this fateful journey to Greece because they discovered, because Toby discovered this Thackeray manuscript, and that paid for the trip, because Thackeray at that time was being read, was enormously popular, and his autographs were valuable. And as a result of that trip, Toby comes down with typhoid and dies, and that enables Vanessa and Virginia to set up home, and the Bloomsbury Group is possible. But trying to do that, and I don't think that worked, actually. I think it didn't work, but it was the best I could do. It was the best I could do.
I think you did a great job. Ash, you and Sam were bringing to life one of the funniest men in 20th century, one of the most brilliant theater directors and movie directors, a man whose achievement was to make a coherent theatrical experience out of all kinds of small pieces, hundreds of moving parts. Did you ever feel challenged to be as funny as Nichols, or to be as good directors as he was? Did you feel like, oh my God, what are we doing here?
Well,
why isn't Mike Nichols writing this book?
I mean, if he had written his own memoirs, you know, maybe we wouldn't have bothered. But it's funny because actually, I think that what you're getting at, I mean, certainly some people are aware of that he has all these qualities, but I think a lot of people were not. And anybody who has had the privilege of spending even a brief amount of time with him, as I have, or Sam, I think that a big reason that we wanted to do this book, in addition to just telling his life story and how was The Graduate made and things like that, but we wanted to kind of capture his essence, and felt like that this might be a good way to do that. And so, so somebody who is as intelligent and charming and sharp and funny and, observant about human behavior does gravitate towards other people who are funny and smart and sharp and observant about human behavior. So luckily, if I had been, had the Mark Harris's job, I might have felt that pressure a little more acutely. But luckily, lots of people were telling us funny stories, and so they, all we had to do was serve it up and to make sure the tape recorder was running. So that he wasn't just, he had an extremely long career, and happily for us had a few, his, it's so front loaded with brilliance, like that was never going to be the issue. Luckily for us, he had a couple of very strong works later in his life, and a few in the middle as well, because that's certainly not a given. There are some people who just kind of, if you think about even a figure that he has a lot in common with Elia Kazan, by the time, Elia Kazan's career is just it's not as long as Mike Nichols, and by the time his later works are just not they're not considered among his best, and so there's a little bit of a tapering off, which is something that a lot of biographers have to just deal with. Luckily for us, there were some really, really strong works, but also it's not just that he was, able to reinvent himself over and over, and that he was prolific and worked, had changed different, more than one art form in America, but he, like Kazan, his directing style really, his background in improv comedy and theater before he got to the movies is very unusual for movie directors, because he would build in, and he was able to do this because he was a success, but he built in a lot of rehearsal time for Hollywood movies, which is totally unheard of. And many actors we talked to said, never saw that again, never experienced that again. And his particular approach to directing was very, he did kind of get this from Kazan, but he wanted to blur the line between the person and the performer. And so he would, during this rehearsal time, it wasn't just about learning the lines and blocking things. It was also about getting to know one another as people. He would tell stories, like very intimate stories about himself, to encourage his other actors to open up and create this kind of, a little bit of just a nakedness between them, and a kind of conspiratorial, dynamic. And so, because there's other directors who, let's say somebody like Woody Allen, who's had a long career and he's made 1 million movies, but I just, from some of the people who Mike work with him as well. And so they would just kind of contrast him sometimes. And, he just has a very different directing style, and you could be in one of his movies without necessarily feeling like you got close with him or anything like that. And so I think Mike's particular approach, worked. He left a real impression on all these people, and the stories from the making of these movies are just a little bit different than you might get on they are more intimate than you might get on other similar sets and things. So I think that he was one thing he said that we quoted from somebody else, like repeating, but is that he said charm is giving away a part of yourself, but something you can do without, essentially. And so he really did do this. He was like just famously the most charming person alive, but he was able to, in all these interactions with people, really leave like a big impression on them and make them feel like they were kind of bonded together. And then even if they only worked on one movie together and that was it or something. So
well, that is a very, very tall order to try to match up to that, I must say. So Craig, I want to ask you about an incident that is in both of your books, which is a story about the Hard Day's Night premiere at which Princess Margaret met the Beatles. This is, a wonderful intersection of both of your worlds. And you told this story somewhat differently in each of the two books. What does it represent thematically or whatever in each of the two books to you?
Yes, that's interesting because I actually didn't, when I was writing the Beatles account, the account in the Beatles book, I didn't look back at the Princess Margaret account, and I still haven't. I mean, I just, so I couldn't actually tell you how they
I'll
did.
tell you.
Oh yeah, no, do tell me if you want. But I mean, it was a pivotal event for Princess Margaret and the Beatles, but also in the sort of wider world of celebrity, because when the Beatles were being driven in their limousine to the movie theatre, they saw all these crowds and they imagined they were for Princess Margaret because she, up to that point, been much more famous than the Beatles. And then they all the fans are in. There were thousands, 10,000 fans out there, all screaming for the Beatles. And actually, it was Princess Margaret who was the sort of add-on for that occasion. And so it was this moment in public life where the celebrities became like royalty, and royalty had to kind of become junior celebrities. And then immediately afterwards, which I also have in both books, I think, there was a party afterwards, and there's George Harrison, who was the youngest of the Beatles. So he was barely 20. He was feeling hungry, and he said, well, when are we going to eat? This was a big thing at the Dorchester Hotel. And he was told, quite severely, well, you're not allowed to eat until the royal family or whoever represents the royal family has left. And so George, who had a kind of stubborn character and obviously had no regard or knowledge of protocol, just went up to Princess Margaret and said, look, we can't eat before you leave. And she said, suddenly she became the deferential one, almost the only time in her life that she was deferential. She said, oh, well, we must be going. So she in some way recognized the power of the Beatles, these kids from Liverpool. And it was a power that endured. And and so while their arc was going up, hers was definitely going down.
Okay, I think we are going to have to go to questions from our wonderful audience. And I am going, because in the interest of time, and also because some of them slightly repeat one another, I'm going to try to summarize them. Gillian, you've got a bunch of questions here, and it's a little bit about one person here is asking how your approach to storytelling has been influenced by your interests, and how the familial quality of her life is something that you wanted to write about. This other person is asking, how did you discover the dominant themes in your book? Did you come by working through the material? I'm going to boil these two things down and say your interest in female familial relationships. How did you personally come to your interest in that and decide to apply it to this subject?
Well, this is my life. I mean, that is my interest. My family is the most important thing in my life. I mean, it's just, that is true. And it's also, as a result, what I know about. I'm quite good on those things. I have a feeling for them. And you have to try and use your talents, As for, I work on the basis of what people put down on paper. So I'm looking, well, first of all, I'm looking for women. I'm really not very interested in men. I read almost all women. I know most of the 20th century of American literature is a blank for me because I can't basically read any of those guys. You know, no. Allen Ginsberg, no, not going to do it. Definitely not William Burroughs, no. So, you know, guys who have shot their wives, that kind of, you know, bars, it's a bar for me to stretch to. So I'm looking for women who are interesting, who have some relation to me, but not a very close one or an obvious one. Someone who allows me to imagine myself in a whole different way, but I have at the basis of it, have a basis of empathy, not antipathy. I think that I cannot imagine writing a book about a woman who I really, really disliked. Now, I came close with Florence Nightingale. She's a very unlikable woman in so many ways. But with the rest, you know, Mary Baker Eddy had nothing in common with her. I came out having very warm feelings for her as a woman. So I'm applying those interests. And then does the woman write something that enables you to feel her presence? Now, I am so interested in what Craig and Ash have done, because they are dealing with the lived person, the person who is actually met. And so you have someone like, say, let's say Virginia Woolf or Queen Victoria, who lights a room up, and you have people saying that. But as a biographer, how do you create that? The only way I can find is to find the textual equivalent of that, right? Where the woman says something, writes something, because obviously I'm not there to hear her say it, not like the people you were able to interview, Ash. What, you know, I have to find that woman, and there she is on the page. Queen Victoria does that. They all do that for me. And therefore I'm able to take out of their text something that speaks to the person. I mean, just to give one example, when Mary Baker Eddy, as a child, apparently is told by her mother that, you know, God will not forgive you unless you are elect, you're one of the elect. And she says, in that case, God is not like my mother, and he will find me a hard case. Now that, you know, I just read that and I said, I'm going to write about that woman, because that woman is able in some ways to put herself on paper for me. And I can feel how it is a woman can create a whole religion on her own and be the leader and write the canonic book. How does she do it? It's because of the effect she has on people. I can't feel that effect. But she does give me indications whereby I can find that electrifying, that magnifying, marvelous person. And, you know, that's how I work.
So I'm going to try to boil down a question here for Craig. There's actually two questions, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to figure out how to combine them. But first of all, Penelope Rollins wants to know if you ever came to a place of sympathy for Princess Margaret, which to me, I think, you know, I felt in the book makes her quite poignant. But you can answer this yourself. And the other question is your decision, which I had noted myself as I was reading, to put yourself in the Beatles book in a couple of places that there are moments when you're talking about, first of all, you know, which Beatle you preferred, but at the very beginning when you're talking about going to visit the Beatles sites in Liverpool and talking to the tour guides and so on. What made you decide to put yourself in that book, in the Beatles book, and not in Princess Margaret?
I do come up briefly in Princess Margaret. Well, first the dream, but also about, I have an account of meeting the Queen. I mean, I sort of pop up a bit. With regard to, yeah, and with regard to the question about this sympathy, there is, I think I have some sympathy. I start the book with a kind of prefacing quote from this old poet I used to know called Paul Potts, which he said something like, "My dreams looked down at me and one said to the other, hasn't life let us down?" And I think by the end of Princess Margaret's life, you do feel that all this amazing potential, the opposite of the Beatles, all this amazing potential unrealized, and just life has let her down. She had let life down as well. Can you just remind me what the other part of the question?
Well, the question was really this: was Princess Margaret a tragic figure or not to you?
Yes, she was. No, sorry, I thought there was another bit.
And the other question was putting yourself in the Beatles.
I mean, I think in some ways I was essential to the Beatles book in the way that I wasn't remotely essential to them. In that I talk quite a lot in the book about my childhood experience of the Beatles, which I couldn't possibly echo exactly other people's experiences. I was at a Roman Catholic boarding school, listening to Revolution Number 9 with a friend aged 10 or so. And we were terrified by Revolution Number 9. It's the one track no one ever plays again of the Beatles. And so we had this game, if we could stay in the completely darkened room and listen to it the whole way through without sort of screaming with horror. So things like that. And my father bumping into John Lennon. And then I deal with the people, the generational difference between my father's generation who fought at Normandy at the same age as the Beatles were, only 20 years later, having this amazing fun. And you can see why that generation, which was only 20 years older, my father born in 1920, John born in 1940, why they did have a resentment of the Beatles. So I have some kind of sympathy. So I bring in quite a lot of autobiographical things. I hope not in a kind of ghastly look at me kind of way, but also I go through. I go to Hamburg and the houses of Paul and John, which are now operated by the National Trust, which mainly looks after stately homes in England. And so I have kind of fun there. And I go to a concert in Liverpool of a lookalike group, and I talk about actually, it quite surprised me, the magic of seeing these good lookalike groups and how they do actually have some kind of mystical effect of transporting you in time. I came to scoff at them, and I was actually entranced. So in that way, they're autobiographical.
I wish we had time to sit here all afternoon, but I know that you guys need to get on with your lives. I'm going to wrap this up now, but we're allowed to have a sort of a 10-minute, 15-minute socializing moment, I guess, online. I'm not sure how this is going to work. Steve, our host, might be able to direct us, but I think if you want to talk to any of us, what can they do, Steve? Help. Tell us what to do.
Well, I suggested in a note in the chat line that using the chat function will work. I mean, you can send notes individually to people or to the whole group. I also suggested there's the raise your hand function that you might be able to find either at the bottom, or depending on your device, either at the bottom of your screen or in the reactions menu. And if you go in there and click on the hand raiser, then your picture will come up and be close to the top, and you can be called on to speak. So this is sort of a first-time thing for all of us. We're not, as Amanda said, we're not exactly sure how it's going to work, but let's see. We could have some creative chaos.
Okay, so thank you all for coming, and thank you really to my wonderful panelists who as I say, I like to just sit here and schmooze with you guys all day because there are things in each of your books that I just want to talk to you about, but we don't have all day. I wish we were gathering in person next year.
Look, there is Beverly Gray has raised her hand, and I think we should hear from her.
Beverly, speak up.
Hang on here, we have to unmute. I have to ask her to unmute. There you go.
And I'm very proud of myself for having found the raise hand icon. But this is for Craig Brown, and I've read the Princess Margaret book, and I have an agent who is very enthusiastic about some of the methods used there. Now, I am attempting a biography of somebody who used to be very famous and who is pretty much unknown unless by specialists now, and that's the designer Rudy Gernrich. And the topless bathing suit notoriety and so on. And when my agent suggested your kinds of methods, I said, but people have to be convinced that he is or was important and has, I feel that I have to validate that, and I'm not sure that the kind of way in which you've written would work for someone who has to be introduced. And I wondered what you thought of that.
Yes, actually, I've just seen you left the message about that, Beverly. I mean, I think you're right and your agent's wrong. That I think both my books were rather reliant on the fame or notoriety of the subjects, because I think everyone comes to Princess Margaret or the Beatles with their own ideas, their own memories. You don't have to explain who they are. You don't, because there have been so many books, particularly about the Beatles, you don't have to explain, that there were 4 people and they came from Liverpool, and that's all been dealt with, and most people would have that in their minds already. So you can then get on with the kind of having fun as a writer. Whereas I think with your subject, I certainly wouldn't know anything about them. And so I think in a way, for the first book about someone, it probably has to be a lot more formal. That was my idea. I think I was very aided by being able to lean on all these previous books and everyone else's memories and opinions and things like that. The Crown actually hadn't come out when I was doing my Princess Margaret, but everyone had some memory or notion of Princess Margaret, and I think they wouldn't with your subject. So I'd say you'd have to do it in a more formal style. I mean, you can have fun. I keep saying having fun, but I think you can put an energy. You can find an energy in a formal way of telling the book. But if I were you, I'd sort of stick to your guns and stick with a more. Basically with your designer, you'd want to know who his parents were and maybe his grandparents, and you'd want to know about the birth and then the death later on, and that's you'd want the basic story. And because both my subjects were kind of mythological in a way, you could presume the basic story as knowledge shared by everyone.
Thank you. Beautiful.
We have Julia Mickenberg had their hand up.
Hi, there's yard work next door, so I've been hesitant to raise my hand, but I'm curious about how you've dealt with like competing perspectives when you've talked to people. I had a question in the chat about just like extremes about the way people have talked about my subject, and I guess this is partly like how much do you insert yourself, or just how have you dealt with those competing perspectives when you're trying to get a sense of somebody who you actually never knew in person? Oh, there it goes.
I mean, can I leap in? I started one of my books with a quotation from William James, Henry James's brother. He said, "We have as many personalities as there are people that we know." And I think that's one of the good things about Ash's oral biography form, is that you can see someone with all their contradictions, and everyone is behaving slightly different with every person they've ever met.
Hey.
And the great biographical fallacy is to kind of join the lines and turn people into a kind of coherent personality or a coherent character. And I think, I think probably all our methods avoid this fallacy by darting around and not joining the dots all the time.
Yeah, I mean, if I can jump in, I agree. I think Craig's right, and what I would say is just, you know, I would just let them contradict each other. And I mean, I will say there were a few things that I heard in the course of all the interviews that I did for the book where one person would tell me something that, you know, none of the other people echoed in any way. And so I just ultimately chose to leave. There were certain notes that were so dissonant, and in the form that I'm working in, if you can't either build on a certain quote or have something that is commenting on it, even if it's contradicting it, you know, you have to, it sort of just, you know, the narrative stops short a little bit, and it's just kind of hanging there. But besides that, yeah, you know, different people did have different perspectives. I mean, and there were, you know, the plus of not working in the traditional format is you can just kind of leave those, you know, edges raw, or, you know, maybe it's, to use a different metaphor, you don't have to kind of cook everything down into a stew. You can just kind of have the different, you know, ingredients. You see, yeah, you can just let the individual perspectives just present them and let the reader kind of make up their own mind about, you know, how something was, or because, you know, sometimes it'll be differing memories and other times it'll be differing opinions. And, you know, I do think that it's, you know, the truth is, you know, you're never really gonna, there is no truth in some of these matters, and other things are, there may have been a truth, but, you know, you may not have access to it now. So you have to just kind of present what you have, and you know, let the reader draw their own conclusions.
We have Sarah.
Great, thank you. This is directed to Gillian. I'm working on a biography of Emily Hale, T.S. Eliot's muse, and he destroyed all of her letters. She wrote a very good letter about meeting Virginia Woolf to one of her colleagues at Scripps College in California. But unfortunately for Hale, because Woolf wrote about her in her diary, Woolf's snobbish view of her was preserved. Pardon? Am I breaking up?
No, Sarah, you froze up there for a second, so we lost.
I'm sorry. I seem to be having this problem despite my FiOS, but can you tell, Kurt, can I send it in a chat question?
We can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Okay. All right. I don't know where it gave out. But the problem of women who just, you know, whose letters get destroyed, and then other women who, because of their prominence, their views get preserved in diaries and things like that. And so it can be a problem in terms of trying to get into a woman's life, and particularly as a myth takes hold about the kind of person she was.
And the question is?
No, I wanted Gillian, I'm sorry, to just comment in terms of, because she's written about many women, and if this has been a problem for her, or if she decided not to pursue somebody, you know, because of access to letters, or, you know, ran into this where a view of somebody had taken hold and it turned out, you know, not to be right.
I think the whole question of documentation is something that I wished we had got into, but I know that in some sense my co-panelists are not using documents in the same way that I do. But in the end, when one writes a biography, however standard, one is writing a story based on extremely fragmentary evidence. And the more you get into anyone's life, on some level, one can only go into the lives of people for whom, I mean, in the past now it's a whole different ball of wax, but in the past, when they left documents and photographs and something, there has to be something to cling on to. But even for the most well-documented, in some ways, I have found the most interesting things are the documents that are not there. And why are they not there? So take Virginia Woolf and her sister, right? We sometimes feel that we know more about them than we do about our own sisters, because there are these masses and masses of letters, the masses of memoirs about them. I mean, we have all these famous people writing about these people. We have these people writing about themselves. They're creating fictional characters. I mean, Virginia Woolf puts her sister in 2 books. I mean, there is this mass of information. And at some point, one feels that there is a smoke screen being put up here because so many of the key things are not there. And notably, the correspondence between Vanessa and Virginia during the time of their father's last years after the death of their sister Stella. So it's 8 years when the two women, intensely ambitious women, are on hold, champing at the bit, ready to get out there, to be a painter, to be a writer. What can they do? They're looking after dad. He is not, he is deaf, he is dying, he is a brake on everything. At the same time, they're being preyed upon by their stepbrother, their half-brother. This is a period of intense conflict in their lives, which Virginia Woolf refers to. Do we have any documentary evidence of that? No, because all of that did not survive. We know it existed, it did not survive. And you then ask yourself, this is something so important in their lives that they had to eliminate it. They had to destroy it. But I think every, comparably, Florence Nightingale, the mass of information on Florence Nightingale that's available. There's just too much to handle. So, but when you dig into those parts of it that interest you, in this case, in my case, again, her familial, my book is called Nightingales. It's not a biography of Florence Nightingale. It's a story of the Nightingale family. You find, amazingly, that early biographies, of which there were several, because she was very, very famous, right? Quote books, quote things that, key parts of her early life. And then you go to the British Library, or you go to Clayton, or you go to the Wellcome Foundation to look, they're not there. They were destroyed. And you think to yourself, whoa, what was it about them that had to be erased from the record by her? So as I say, all of that kind of thing totally fascinates me. I suspect it doesn't fascinate everybody else, but I do sympathize with you in that you have to have some records, and yet so often, Colette, all of her relationship with her mother, all we know about it is really what she wrote about it 10 years after her mother's death, okay? Because all of her letters to her mother were destroyed probably by her brother. So we don't have that key piece of information. So, in every life, Jane Austen, her sister, destroys her letters. This is the work. This is life for a biographer.
I could just interject quickly something here that would add to what Gillian is saying. It's fascinating why things are destroyed. I am currently writing about 2 women in the 18th and early 19th century, the Schuyler sisters, one of whom was married to Alexander Hamilton, the other of whom was her older, sexier, more out there sister, who had a sort of epistolary, possibly other kind of romance with her brother-in-law. Hamilton's wife's letters to her husband do not survive at all. And the question there is, how do you document the relationship between the husband and the wife when only one side of the correspondence exists? Well, in actual fact, you can extrapolate quite a bit from that. Someone says, oh, you told me so-and-so. And, there it is. You've got what they told, that's how you do it. You can also find out, and you can track people in third-party correspondence. It says that somebody was here at a certain point. There's all kinds of ways that you can be a detective and find things out. I know it's really hard, but it's kind of fascinating to do that. And I think, Gillian is right about women's correspondence has not always been kept and with the same reverence that men's correspondence has been, and makes it a little harder. So,
if I could just add, I think I mean, as Gillian said, this was not a big part of the way we approached our book, but I think Mike Nichols had no papers, and it's not that there's no documentary evidence out there or nothing on paper, but he didn't collect them. He didn't was not a kind of he was not helping out his future traditional biographer. And I think that if Mark Harris or somebody had decided to undertake a traditional biography, even 5 years from now, when after certain key people had died, they would have had a much harder time.
I have emails from him, weirdly. We had a pen pal friendship. I should have told you.
Yeah, he was a good emailer.
And I think he had them with lots of people.
We have one last question, I think. If we can go to Celia, then this will probably be our last one.
Okay, thank you. This is actually for Gillian as well. I'm fascinated by your book, Virginia Woolf. I haven't read it yet, but I'm anxious to read it. And I was interested in when you were talking about how you're changing the interpretation of Woolf from a victim to a victor, because you talked about how in the beginning, when you're researching, you don't have any real conclusions, right? You're wanting to find out the information, and you don't really know how it's going to end. And so I was wondering if in your process in researching, was there one document or several documents that led you to this idea that really we should look at Woolf as a victor, not a victim? Just to hear a little bit more about your process in writing about her as a victor, because I think a lot of women writers and artists are often pigeonholed as victims. And so I know I wrote about Frida Kahlo, and she's often viewed as a victim. And so this was something that I also grappled with my research and writing, because I don't see her as a victim either. So anyway, I'd just like to hear more about your process, Gillian. Thanks.
Well, first of all, I started off late in life. I was in my 40s before I even began to write books. And from the beginning, I was looking in my writing life for the lives of women who would inspire me. And that meant in my case that they didn't die at the age of 32, and they weren't famous just because their husbands were famous or because their fathers were famous or their brothers were famous. That they did something in their own life and they conquered obstacles, because I was conquering obstacles when I was writing my first book. So I'm looking for women as, this is trite, but role models. So women who got to be old, women who got to succeed, women who did okay, and women who had to struggle to do it and weren't necessarily supported that much, okay? So that's what I'm looking for. Now, in Virginia Woolf's case, she is sort of famously a victim because she committed suicide. Now, I would say, for one thing, if you look at the average life spans of women of her generation, she wasn't that young when she died. And what struck me is, now that we know so much more about severe mood disorders, yes, we can look at her and see the challenges she was meeting just to keep going, to keep the madness at bay, and the way she developed strategies for dealing with her condition. We all have conditions. Every one of us is going to die of something. We're all battling something, okay? She was battling a mood disorder of a very severe kind that started when she was 13 years old. To me, that she, you know, she tries to commit suicide several times in her life. She is saved, and she learns from that. She says, what can I do to keep going? And it takes World War II, having her home in London totally destroyed, having the German bombers whizzing over her head, and knowing that she and Leonard, because she has married a Jewish man, are sort of on the list. So this is 41, 42, right? Britain is facing an imminent invasion from Germany, and she's living in Kent, right? I mean, in Sussex. She's so close to the border. She can practically see the British Channel. She knows that she's going to be out. So what does she do? She, you know, has the means of committing suicide. She and Leonard get, you know, a fatal potion. It takes all of those things to break through her coping mechanisms. That to me is a triumph in life.
I think we're running out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you all for a wonderful, wonderful session.